Hi, this is Peter Teuscher. I'm here with Tobi Dempiker. Thanks for joining us for another podcast where we talk about personal, professional, and organizational development, and maybe a little philosophy thrown in there. We usually just have a conversation and we pick a topic and see where the conversation takes us. And hopefully you'll find that interesting. And if you do, please like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. And share with others if you're just listening to the audio podcast. So thanks again for joining us. How are you doing today, Tobi?
I'm doing pretty good, thank you. It's the end of the summer is kind of here for us in Sweden, so we're starting going back to normality, which is good and bad. But it's a good time to reflect on the different roles we play, and that is aligned to the topic at hand for today, right? Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I'm looking forward to this one. So yeah, why don't you lead us in with your topic for this week?
Okay, so I think it was last time we spoke, we kind of had an as we were chatting about what to talk about during the podcast, we got into this topic of different roles we play, and I think both of us kind of realized that this is something which is kind of a personal topic that we might be, at least I feel like I've been struggling with a little bit. So it's about the different roles you can play, and I mean, for me personally, it can be being a father or a husband, or being a facilitator, or being a coach, or being a business leader, or being an entrepreneur, or being a football coach, or being a bass player, or we all play a lot of different roles. And for me, it's interesting to think about this, and also to read about what different people say about authenticity and the roles that you play. And because obviously in the workplace nowadays, it's very, very complex, and maybe more if in the past it was more traditional that you had one role or one kind of thing that you stuck to. But more and more, I think I realize, and I think a lot of people would agree, that we have to juggle all these different roles, even in the workplace. I mean, you're not just a welder anymore. You might be that, and a project manager, and a leader with staff responsibilities, etc. And to juggle this, it can be a real struggle. I mean, for me as an individual, and how to deal with it, and how can I be honest and sort of authentic in all these different roles, and find a congruency that works. So I thought we could explore that a little bit from a personal and maybe also philosophical or scientific perspective.
Absolutely, and obviously, me as a systemic coach, that my training, my background, although I've worked on different modalities, but the systemic approach is one that is at the center of the work I do, and so systemically speaking, the different roles that we play are very significant, because we have our inner system, and then there's also the outer system of, the workplace or the family or so on. So, which is an interesting way to look at it. So yeah, I think there's a lot of things to talk about today. I think roles also, plays into the whole topic of identity. People identify as different things, and I think a lot of people don't realize that they play different roles in different situations. They may just think that I adapt from one situation to another, but you can play a strong leadership role in at work or in your organization. And then at home, if you're also having to, be the leader of your family, so to speak, or hopefully most relationships now have evolved into a more partnership and more equality. But when you look at the old kind of role models, some people are still stuck in those. And I think today I'd really like to spend some time to talk about, the recognizing the different roles that we play. And the assumptions we may make about that. What skills do we need? How those roles that we're kind of pushed into can be overwhelming for us. I mean, when I think of, a career mother who's trying to, there's a lot of stigma around, women who stay at home. Maybe not so much in Sweden, but in some countries, I talk to women who are like, well, yeah, I want to have a professional life, but I also would prefer to spend more time with my kids. But there's this stigma around, well, if I don't follow a career, then I'm not living a full life just being a mother. And so there's all these different social influences that affect the kind of roles that we play. And there's also this wanting to belong and then so the question is, how much authenticity am I giving up in order to meet the expectations of my peer group, the social network that I'm part of, and so on. So yeah, it's a really deep topic with a lot of implications.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, and for me, the sort of starting point or go-to point would be if I think about, or at least when I talk about leadership, I refer a lot to transformational leadership, because it seems like that has the strongest sort of scientific backing in terms of leadership effectiveness. And a very central piece of this is about authenticity and being a role model where your actions and words are congruent. And it seems like most people are willing to follow a leader that can be perceived in this matter, right? And I think most of us can relate to that. If we come across such a leader, it's easy to wanting to listen or follow him or her if we perceive this person as authentic and honest, and that the actions and the words are congruent. And I've just been thinking, for a leader like that, I mean, you can behave in such a way in the workplace, but for most people, when you come home and you take off your shoes and get back, you enter a new context, and if it's the family setting or whatever different setting it is, you take on another role, and your behaviors will change a little bit, and the dynamics will change a little bit. So you take off that hat and put on another hat. And it seems to be really important also in leadership to be able to juggle these different hats. I mean, if you look at Belbin's theories about different roles that you have in teams, I think a lot of really agile and good leaders are able to juggle these roles or different hats in a good way. So even as a leader, now it's time to be the coaching type, or at certain times it's the times when you need to be a bit more commanding or whatever. And sometimes you just have to be a team player. I mean, and for me personally, when I'm leading a project or something, and it's more of a taking responsibility and driving things, putting up goals and objectives, etc. But in a different context, as a football coach, for instance, I can be a little bit more of the supportive leader and doing things on the side. There's very different types of role. It's all related to leadership, but it's in very different contexts.
Yeah, so I think there's different leadership styles you can have and ways of interacting with people, but I think it becomes more pronounced in different situations, like when you're in your home life, when you're with your friends, when you're with your peer group, or when you're with customers or a management team. People don't often realize they step into different roles, and I remember I was part of a workshop years ago, and there was one of the top managers was taking part. He was at the board level, and he was convinced that he was always the same person in every situation, right?
Yeah.
And he kind of, you could tell from his when other people kind of expressed the fact that, yeah, well, I have to be a different kind of, I have to play a different role in different situations. He was like, no, I'm the same person wherever, with my wife, with my family, with, with the board, or with customers. And he just saw that as being real, as being authentic. And so I think, it's important to have enough awareness that you do make shifts. For some people, it's more subtle. Especially people who are very confident in who they are, so some of the differences can be very, very subtle. But I think that you definitely play different roles when you are in your home life, in your private life, just in terms of the language that you use, and there are elements of your personality that come to the forefront. in different situations. And that doesn't mean you're being unauthentic or you're doing it's about applying a certain skill set or applying certain certain elements of your personality. So, I remember, you're obviously very professional to work with, and the as a trainer facilitator, the kind of role that you're playing is different than I imagine you, because that's why it caught me off guard when you said, "Yeah, I'm a heavy metal fan," right? And because you automatically have this other people will have this perception. But if you're playing in your band, you are playing a different role than when you're a facilitator. And I've had this conversation with people who get nervous talking in front of crowds, and I'm not really that much of an extrovert. So I don't cherish being in the limelight. And so my preparation for, giving a workshop for a bigger group, like 80 to 100 people, which is an unusually large size, but that's why we do it with multiple trainers. But, I will actually, step into this role of being trainer, facilitator. I'm this expert that people have come to see. I build it up for myself, just in order to deliver what people expect. And I think that's a lot of the roles we play are trying to meet people's expectations, and trying to be this, be the person that people, especially as a leader, you want to show the strong side of you. You're the very decisive. And you get into that leadership role, but that can be overwhelming if you're always having to be in that role, right? And there needs to be times when you can be vulnerable, when you can be, you don't have to have just all those one-sided characteristics, right?
Yeah. No, it's interesting because. And I guess what you're saying as well is that for the individual, it can be unnoticeable that we take on this different role. It's something that we learn, and after a while, maybe that we do it intuitively. That we, as you say, when we step in a role as a facilitator, it's very different from being the house guy or whatever you're doing. It's a very different role. You take on a different language and different behaviors, etc. Maybe different expressions even. After a while, I think for us as trainers, that's nothing that we really think about. But if my wife would watch me in a training setting, I think it would be kind of uncomfortable for her, and this can take many different shapes. I mean, for me, before we started chatting here on sort of video, I was saying that when I was a teenager, this became a problem for me because I had a lot of different kinds of friends, different groupings of friends. Mm-hmm. And I realized that, these people don't match together, and I probably act differently with different people. But after a while, I realized that that's not really my problem anymore. It's their problem. So I started to neglect that, and people could just hook up over sort of the group lines, and it worked fine. I mean, it wasn't anything that I needed to put extra pressure on myself to deal with. So, yeah, but it's interesting how this happens without ourselves having the awareness that now I'm taking a new role. As we develop as people and professionals, it seems like this happens intuitively, and then our palette grows so we can juggle these different roles in a different way.
Yeah,
but of course, at some point it can become overwhelming as well.
Yeah, but I think to go back to the point that you made originally about authenticity, I don't think it's necessarily unauthentic. You're just bringing certain parts of your personality and certain elements of your skill set to the forefront, and that's what I mean about when I consciously make this mental shift when I'm getting up in front of a group of people to in order to be the most effective at that as possible. I step into a role, a persona, right? I mean, probably not to the degree that an actor would. And I still feel I'm being authentic. I'm still expressing myself in ways that are authentic to me, that express my values. But in order to facilitate and to share what I'm trying to do, it's just like when someone is a teacher, of, whether it's a university professor or a grade school teacher, they assume that role of teacher because the people that they're trying to teach, they need that, right? They need you to take on that role, and people who aren't willing to sort of step into that role, that either the group may not respect them, or at the very least that you won't have the effect that you're wanting to have. But I think when you talk about going back to your youth, it's interesting because I said to you before, I'm a bit of a late bloomer, but it took me a long time to figure out what I wanted to do with my life and to sort of work through all my past issues and stuff. And so I don't think I really started to consciously work on myself until I was about 30. And I remember my ex-wife, and at the beginning she would say, "You should hear yourself when you talk to your mom, right? You turn into a little kid, right?" And I had no idea. I didn't realize it. And then a few years later, and I'd done a lot of personal work on, personal development stuff. It's an ongoing process. But she said, "Yeah, you don't talk to your mom that way anymore." And it wasn't like I'm consciously being different, but I no longer step into that role of the son, in terms of that kid that needing to please their mother, or being scolded, or being submissive or whatever, and managing to have an adult relationship with my mom where I'm the confident, mature man, rather than the kid that that she's using, had to be the caregiver of, and so on. And so that for me was a very fundamental shift in my relationship with her, and it made huge improvements, especially for me. So there are those things that that you may not realize that you're doing, and then there are the shifts that you make consciously, right? I think if you, especially in a leadership role in an organization, there are situations where people expect you to step up. That's your role, right? And you assume that role. And that doesn't mean you always need to be in that full-on, but there are situations where it's needed, right? And so there are times when you do it consciously, and there are times when you do it unconsciously. But just being aware that you step into different roles, and it's not about being inauthentic. It's about there are different parts of your inner system that come to the forefront, right? And hopefully, that really confident, decisive person that you may be in the work environment is not necessarily the one that you are in your relationship with your partner, where where you show a little bit more vulnerability, and it's a more cooperative, and you let the other person take the lead sometimes, or whatever. So I think it's just something to be very aware of. And if you try to force those roles, I think this is going back to the authenticity piece. It's important that the role that you step into is still authentic for you.
Yeah. I agree.
It's just bringing parts of something that's already there and bringing it more into focus. It's not about playing this fake role, or trying to be someone you're not.
Yeah. And a part of that, of course, is when we're stepping into a new role. Now we're maybe I'm focusing a lot on leadership development, but when you're stepping into a new role as a leader, you don't necessarily know what that role looks like for you, or what it feels like. So of course we talked before about the comfort zone. How do you stretch that, and what is it going to look like when people are putting expectations on me and judging me for what I'm doing or not doing, or how I'm talking, and also the part of leadership development when you're stepping up maybe in the organization or in the hierarchy because of certain skill sets that you have, if you've been an expert or whatever, and all of a sudden you have a greater people management responsibility, and that's a very different skill set. So how do you take on this role of maybe letting your previous skills, setting them a little bit more in the background, and nurturing new skills that you need to develop? That's a really tough balance, right?
Yeah,
So the part of developing these roles, as you said, it's probably an ongoing process that we all have to struggle with, or that we all have to manage in some way.
Yeah, and it's interesting that we often, positions within a company, we call them roles for a reason, right?
Yeah.
You develop certain skills that allow you to execute that role, right? And it's a function that you're playing within an organization. It's a function that you have within your relationship, your group of friends. Within your friends, you'll have the one who's really good at bringing everybody together and organizing things, or the one who it makes everybody laugh, or so they're just different skill sets that come into focus, that come to the forefront, and I think that's a really healthy way to look at it.
Yeah.
Um,
And also this part of sensing in this matter, I think it's super important how when you're stepping in or developing these new roles, to sensing what are the needs here, what are the needs from myself and from others, and also being very alert to what's working and what's not working. We talked about authenticity, and I think I've mentioned this before, but uh, there's a professor, her name is Ibarra, I think. She's talking about the authenticity paradox, that we're very, I mean, in leadership development, we're talking a lot about authenticity and the importance of it, but there's also a great risk to it. She's mentioning that depending on how we define authenticity, we talk a lot about vulnerability. It's great to be able to be vulnerable as a leader. Brené Brown talks a lot about this. Um, However, what is the occasion? There are certain occasions that the followers don't want the leader to be too vulnerable or to show, whatever kind of fears, so at certain points there needs to be more confident. And even if you're feeling a little bit awkward or afraid of this, is this something that you want to demonstrate or act out? And in certain contexts, it's probably not the right choice to do. And that's how do you define authenticity then? Then you have to kind of take on another role and seem more confident than you might actually feel. And that's part of sensing the needs of the followers and what the situation kind of needs from you. So it's not an easy recipe. How do you balance authenticity and the needs that the role requires right now?
Yeah, so it's again the authenticity part is you have a lot of different elements to who you are, and so people they'll maybe identify more strongly with some parts of their personality and don't recognize other parts, or they have this idea of who they want to be or who they think they should be, and they're striving towards that, and then they're asked to play a role that feels like maybe in conflict with that. So again, if we go back to what authenticity means to me, at least, it's about your behaviors matching your values and so on. But that doesn't mean that all of those values have to be at play at every minute of the day. So it's again, bringing those things that are authentically part of you and fit the situation and bringing those more in focus. But I think a lot of people aren't really that aware of the sort of their inner system. Psychologists will talk about your inner child, maybe, which are those patterns of behavior that you developed, in childhood. And look, I've seen when someone, a manager, I've seen managers flip out, right? Or I've had people describe, a situation where a manager just completely lost it, and I think about, I wonder if he was that kid in the grocery store on the ground, flailing his arms because he didn't get what he wanted, right? And that behavior just adapted in adult life. It evolved into something that seemed more adult, but equally as immature as. And so we have these patterns of behavior, these needs that we have of these different parts of us, and you can give them different names. Like we'll talk about the inner judge, where the inner critic, where you're very focused on your, hypersensitive about what you're doing wrong, or the inner judge, which is constantly looking at judging other people and criticizing what they're doing wrong. And there are lots of different elements to this. And I think the psychologist that really did a ton of work on this on a personal and family level, which I find really helpful to use also in a business situation or whatever, is Bert Hellinger, and he he started with this family constellation. So looking at what are the different elements of your family, and also what are the different elements internally. So you have your inner system, you have your system immediately around you, and so the sort of fundamental. He believed that there were these three governing principles in any kind of let's call it an emotional system, but it's really a social system, whether it's your internal representation of it or the external one. But so the three governing principles are that the need for belonging. So we all have the need, where we've evolved as these, as primates who've basically thrived on cooperation, right? So, there was a time in our evolutionary history where, being cast out of your group meant that it was a life and death thing, your whole survival. So I think we have this need, this sense of belonging. We also have a need for social order. So that's why these natural hierarchies will establish themselves. Previously this is part of the modern day struggle we have. It used to be roles were very clearly defined, for better or for worse, right?
Yeah.
But they were clearly defined, and it made it easier. There were very clear lines. So the man's role was this, the woman's role was this, the children's role was this. Grandparents did this. Like within a family unit, the roles were very, very clear on gender and so on. And that and it's interesting. There's a guy who does a lot on relationships, David Dida, and he talks a lot about how this. How in the 50s it was much easier because you had the man was the dominant one, the woman was the submissive one, and that's the roles were very clear and the dynamics were didn't change much. Obviously there was a need to change that that mindset, and I have no desire to go back to those those days. So don't get me wrong, I'm not promoting that, but it makes for a much more complex social environment where the roles aren't as clearly defined. My brother, after we had a business together after we sold that, he went to being a stay-at-home dad. His wife was the primary breadwinner, and and he loved that. He embraced that role, and that's still to this day it's somewhat unconventional, right? So I think in terms of roles, it's a really interesting one. So, but we do have a need for social order, and so even though now roles aren't as clearly defined, and we have the freedom, regardless of your gender or your race, we have all these different options. There are countries in the world where you still have caste systems and so on, and it's hard to get out of those. But thankfully, we are evolving, and so. But regardless, we have to keep in mind that we still have this need for social order. So we still need to know our place in the world, or our place within a social group or within a family, and that social order is really important. And then the third governing principle is that this need for equilibrium, right? And it's this need for give and take, reciprocity, the fact that you're going to do things for people, and it's very altruistic to go, well, I'm doing things regardless of what I get back. But on some level, we're all looking for a degree of reciprocity, and that means that if you make a contribution to your community or to your family or to your team at work, that there's going to be some give and take, and you'll reach equilibrium, and so those are sort of the three governing principles, and that. Hellinger very much focused on the family and the different generations and how all the interplay within that system. So because everything is systemic. So whether it's a family, whether it's a school, whether it's an organization, even a country, it's systemic. And
Yeah.
so um, when you look at it systemically and you look at the different those guiding principles, that really helps you understand, where's my place in the world, and the need that we have for each other. Like Stephen Covey talks about the sort of three levels of development, where we begin as being dependent, we strive for independence, and then at some point when we become aware and interactive and part of the community, we recognize interdependence, which is sort of the top level of awareness. And some people still always stay in that, trying to be independent, and really what we need is more people recognizing how interdependent we all are. So anyway, so from a roles perspective, it's interesting to look at it systemically. What role am I playing within my family? What role am I playing within my group of friends? In any organization, like you say, in sports. In Germany we have these sports clubs, and it's a very communal thing. So people contribute and they help each other. That's what makes it all work.
Yeah.
Communal living. But even if keep to yourself a lot and you have limited interaction, you're still none of us could survive on our own. We don't have the skills anymore, right? And we all rely on our political systems, our social systems, our governing, our laws, and the systems of bringing food to the stores. Like we're just so reliant on all the very complex structures that we've built for ourselves, and then recognizing the roles you play within those complex structures is really important. And the more you can recognize that, the more you can kind of transition into those roles comfortably and bring the skill sets that are needed in those roles.
Yeah.
Sorry, it was a bit of a ramble on there.
No, that's super interesting. And maybe we could do a link to that in the YouTube channel or something. But I reflected on a few things when you were talking about that. I mean, first of all, how well it aligns with team development. If we're looking at, work from Susan Whelan or Tuckman, how we go from a belonging sense in team development, where that's the prior need in the first stages, and then we move on to searching for this. What did you call the second need? The social.
We need some sort of social order.
Yeah, the social order, and how that can translate into finding your place in the hierarchy, and can lead to a lot of conflict as well. And then in the more mature stages, where we translate that into interdependency or something like that. So that fits really well with that, which is interesting. Also to see what people need when you're in this in a group or a team dynamic, and how these needs of finding roles and defining your roles in that process sort of develops. But also, I was also thinking about in the modern workplace, how much of it is that you have to sort of define your own roles now, that we're leaving these social order where everything is, set. You should do this, and you had to create your own value and find your own role and drive that yourself. And if you're not used to working in that way, that's a real shift. How do I start doing this?
It's really stressful for people, and it causes a lot of underperformance when people's roles aren't clearly defined for them. In the workplace, it causes a lot of issues. It can cause struggles among people in a team, because they're jockeying for position. It can cause people to kind of feel like they have no direction, and feeling kind of lost. But clearly defined roles is one of the most important things for any leader to be doing within their team. That's a fundamental piece of team development.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess it's it's something that where we can be struggling with, and especially in the modern workplace, that more and more in certain organizations, just have to find something to do and prove your value. There's no one's going to tell you what to do, and it's from an efficiency or an effectiveness point of view, it's great if you have roles, but it doesn't look like organizations or the world is going into the direction where everything will be predefined for you. We have to define our own roles. So that's really interesting from a personal development point of view. How do I deal with this? How can I learn to define my own roles, how to behave effectively in different roles, and then maybe especially how do I deal with that stress that this can apply. That you have one role at home and it might be very different from the role that you're having in various professional environments or other contexts as well, right?
Yeah, and I think it's important to recognize, people just aren't cut out for every role, right? And so it's if you are not able to deal with ambiguity, if you need structure and very clearly, then recognizing that, well, maybe you're not set up, you're not meant to be an entrepreneur where you have to, define the role for yourself, or you're not meant to be in a company that's kind of a startup that needs you to wear a lot of hats. And if you're the kind of person who needs a lot of structure and a very clearly defined role, that's fine. It's just knowing that about yourself. So and there, you have more and more people asking this question about, what's my role in this organization? And that goes back to purpose and identity. And, people will join companies because they relate to their brand, or they identify with certain values that they perceive in an organization. And then when they enter that organization, then they are feeling lost and they don't feel like they're, what's my role here? And it's a huge piece of motivation in when we talk about purpose, recognizing what your contribution means within the greater organization. In other words, understanding your role as part of the community, right? And so that goes, the whole need for belonging and that social order, that's super important. And then also to the third piece about equilibrium, the give and take, because you want to make sure that, I don't think we feel comfortable taking, most people don't anyway, taking without being able to give back. And so it's so feeling like what your contribution is, what your role is, therefore how you can contribute, so that you feel good about getting things back or earning your salary or whatever. So psychologically, it plays a big role.
So that's the reciprocity that you were talking about before, perhaps.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm happy that I'm glad you mentioned that about the purpose, because I also strongly believe that, I mean, a real support for a lot of us when we're dealing with these different roles is just thinking about, why am I doing this? What's the purpose of me of having this role? And it can be very different. Some might be just to develop ourselves. I mean, if it's for instance, if we're taking on a challenge as a new role, it's because it might be expectations, but also because we want to develop a few skills or learn something new. Or I mean, as a father, it might be, I want to provide safety or development for my family and financial support or whatever it might be. But just thinking about that, and the purpose of why you're having different roles might push different kind of behaviors, right? And some behaviors are needed more in a certain context rather than the other. So I think that's really, really important to think about the why as well. Why am I doing this? And not necessarily feel like, oh, this is something that I have to do all the time. Is this something that you want to do, or have you chosen to do it, or is it just something that has been pushed on you? Then it's going to be a different reaction to it, right?
Yeah, and you'll find a lot of the discontent or people feeling unhappy in their workplace is because they've compromised some of their values in order to take on a role that isn't really who they are. I mean, I've known of people who, they went to law school and they thought this is maybe because of pressure from, our expectations from family, but they went to law school, which is, it's a long path of education. And then they get into the position, they take on this role that, that their education has prepared them for, and they realize this just isn't me. I just don't feel comfortable in this role. I don't feel good about myself. And they start to realize, actually, this is, contrary to my values, at least in the role that they're put in, as a lawyer. There are people who don't have any issue with defending, people that have done bad things, and everybody deserves a defense. But there are people that go, I just can't. I know that I'm getting people off of things that when they've knowingly done things wrong or whatever, right? So, that's not let's focus on very one negative element. Obviously, the legal process. I actually just last week met with a dear friend of mine who's one of the nicest lawyers you'll ever meet, and always really very genuine and really. So I think in North America, at least, there's a lot of lawyers have a bad reputation, and certainly I don't want to pigeonhole anyone, because I know some very genuinely nice lawyers, but that's just one example of someone who takes the path, and it could be the same for a doctor who, think about the long career of the long process of education to become a doctor, and then you realize, it's just, this role doesn't feel right for me. And so I think when you can reflect a little more about, sometimes you do have to grow into a role. You develop the skills that allow you to perform that. But sometimes you learn all the skills, and then when you go into execute, and you realize, it just doesn't feel right for me. And I think a lot of times where I see people conflicted, and this is where, I was talking about the different elements of our personality, and these different elements have needs. Like when in psychology, they talk about how you can't just get rid of this inner child or this part of you that I've been part of group work on this, where a person will have identified sort of this inner rebel in them, and this inner, but also this kind of parental needing security and safety, and all of these different parts of our inner system have needs, and if one role that you're in causes you to neglect too much the needs of another part, there'll be incongruence and inner conflict in you. And so it's important to be able to live those different roles so that you can be authentic, but also be taking care of the different needs that you have internally. And so if a job demands things of you that cause you to neglect certain areas of your values or parts of your personality, let's say you work with numbers or account, and you are your life is very one-sided, and you don't get the chance to express the sort of creative side of you. That over time, that will build up a lot of internal pressure, and it'll lead to unhappiness. And so the point I wanted to get to is, for example, people who are transitioning from being single to in a relationship to being a parent. You have that role as a parent, but that doesn't mean that you're not, I think some women really struggle with this, that just because you're a mother and nurturing doesn't mean you're not a sexual, you don't have needs and desires there. And they try and balance that. Or if you're a father and you want to be that nurturing, good role model and so on, but you also want to go let off some steam with the guys and have a night out, or in sports, I'll see guys on the basketball court who get upset and lose their cool and whatever. They get really ambitious, and it's all about the competition. But some of the things they do and the way they express themselves wouldn't necessarily be the things that they want to, display for their children, right? So,
Yeah.
but they have that in them, and they need an outlet for that, which is healthy if you can find a healthy outlet. And then so there are those different roles that you play, and recognizing that they all are justified, and there's no getting rid of them. You have those needs. If that's part of your system, that's part of you, who you are. It's important to respect all of those different elements and give them those elements an outlet, and recognition, and understand what the needs are. And if you can do that, that's your big step towards being a happier, more well-rounded person.
Yeah. Well, I'm kind of envisioning some kind of canvas, where you have different kind of colors, and with different roles, we're adding colors to the whole canvas. But if we're adding a lot of red for a certain mile, it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that the blue will disappear. It will still be there, right? And it might be covered a little bit by the red, but it will still be there, and it'll still have the needs. And certain roles might take different space, or taking over in our lives for a certain while, but the needs and the previous roles that we've had, they will still be there, right? And it's really interesting. I mean, I haven't actually been to one of these for a long time, but if you think about going back to a class reunion from how many years it might have been, I don't know, but very fast you step into these roles that you used to have 20, 30 years ago. That color is still there. I mean, but the other colors that you put to the canvas, they might sort of overrule that color in different contexts, but it's still there, and we can find back to it very quickly.
Yeah.
So that's and I think it's really important to stress that it's being authentic and being yourself. It doesn't mean that you're the same person for the rest of your life. We can always continue to develop and find new roles and new skills, etc. However, there are parts of maybe it's personality, but our needs that they will always be there, and we can always go back to them. So, and then that in language, I think it's interesting as well. I mean, looking at, of course, if you have a calling, you mentioned being a doctor as an example before. I am a doctor. But for certain professions where there's less of a calling, maybe you can be an author, or you are an author. Like I'm acting as an author right now, or I am an author. It's kind of two different things. Are you a project manager, or are you being a project manager right now? And also thinking about that again, why am I doing this? Is this a calling, or is this a role that I'm taking on right now? And I can let it go. I have other roles that I can play as well, but it doesn't define you, right? It's not that limit that totally defines who you are.
Yeah, that's a super important point. I'm really glad you brought it up, because how we identify, the things that we identify with can be limiting. It can really dictate some of our behavior, and especially if there's a major change in life, what does that mean for you? So I think recognizing that you play those different roles, and they're all part of you, but if you identify too strongly with one, it'll bring your life out of balance. So if you're really, I found it interesting moving from Canada to Germany, and then when on the TV you'll see someone who's introduced, or there's a quick descriptor, and the typical things. Okay, they'll have their name, they'll have their age, their marital status, and maybe what they studied. So they'll be an engineer or whatever, and so that is like who they are, and but that's not all of who you are. Who you are can't be summed up in what you do for work, or your age or your marital status. And the thing is, though, what happens to people who then have been in a certain role and they're made redundant, and they can't find a job in that area. So what does that mean about their identity? They'll feel lost if they're overly identified with that. I know when I, at the end of my marriage, when I was identified in this, I'm a husband, I'm a married person in this relationship, and that was my identity, and quite honestly, I went through a bit of a crisis. Then, and part of what kept me clinging on to the situation was this identity of being divorced. Like, I don't want to have to call myself that, or well, I'm divorced. That's now my new identity, right? And so there was a real resistance against that. And so we stigmatize some roles. We cling on too strongly to some roles, and that can really cause conflict in our or cause us to lose our sense of identity, or this sense of not knowing who we are, and recognizing. So it's really important to recognize the roles that we play are just elements of and skill sets. They're just patterns of behavior that we bring to the forefront. And if you identify too strongly with them, those skills and those qualities are still there, even if you're not performing that role in that certain capacity. And so I think being too strongly connected, and the same thing will happen if there's restructuring in a job, in an organization, and you're no longer responsible for this kind of stuff, and people have trouble making the transition. But then we go back to, well, what does your new role need from you now, right? What role do you need to play now? And so I think, again, just being aware of what that means, to play a role. It's and it's funny that you made that reference to colors, because I remember I was talking about that manager who insisted that I'm the same person all the time. We were doing some work on the colors model, which I find fairly similar to Marsden's disc model, and we were talking about, okay, what color? So everybody's personality has maybe more yellow or more blue or whatever, but we'll have little pieces of it in all of us. And then we were talking about different situations where the certain color would come out more, for example, and that's where that whole conversation started. No, I'm the same everywhere. I'm the same with everyone. And that goes back to that point about, we have needs. And this is why I really like the Berkman model, where we talk about the Berkman model talks about your usual behavior, your stress behavior, your needs, and then when you can look at it that way, you can recognize, well, there are systemically speaking, there are different needs that you have in different situations based on, the different internal roles or parts of your personality, but also situational. So, you have your kind of baseline, you're typically, but then in stress situations, you people who get super angry and afterwards, I don't know what came over me, right? Yeah. Well, it was stress. It was a certain situation that brought out a part of your personality, and it was a role that you played. And I think it's really important to recognize what situations trigger certain parts of your personality. In other words, what certain situations trigger you to step into a certain role. When you're out with the guys, are you being authentic to yourself, or you're trying to be this kind of macho guy, right? So, you start to recognize whether there's congruence there, and you'll hear people say, I'm just not that person anymore, right? Because we evolved, because maybe back then we weren't being as authentic because we didn't have such a clear sense of our identity, and now as you get older and you become more self-assured in yourself, you can play more authentic roles, but you can still shift. It doesn't mean that you have to be constantly this one person all the time.
Yeah, and so personally, I can feel that. So sometimes I can really feel inside me that I'm on some kind of weird balance here between different roles, how I used to act more before, or what feels more correct or more natural right now, and sort of being pulled a little bit there. So that's interesting. Also, the last thing I want to mention, related to what yourself said about needs and being under stress, etc., is this empathetic note that we all play different roles, and so we should be careful of how strong we are judging others, right? Because when we're judging something or someone, that we always do, that whether we like it or not, it's just one part of the personality. It's one part of the person. It's the role. You might see a person in a certain situation, and in that situation, this person has taken on a role where it used to be, and the person is much more than that. So having also a bit of empathy of others, that there's always a lot more to the person than we see. And I feel, because I work a lot with leaders, and typically I think a lot of people are very harsh on their leaders, because
Mm.
it's very difficult to be a leader, but also to having a bit of empathy to our leaders. It's not an easy job. If it was an easy job to do, anybody could do it. But to have a bit of an empathy that they're also, discovering this and trying to develop, and we're never perfect. So.
Yeah, I know you're right. I mean, leadership is a difficult role. I've been in leadership roles, and it's not easy. But that's the reason we get hired to give these workshops and coach people and
Yeah, I
help
guess.
them through it, because it is difficult. And
Mm,
we don't learn any of these things in school. We become good at a certain job. We develop a certain skill set, and then we're expected to be able to lead people because of that skill set we've developed. That has nothing to do with the people management and the leadership skills that you need. And so leaders are developed. Their leaders are made. They're not
mm,
born.
mm,
And I think a really great example of that is in sports. You see these people that evolve into a leadership role, and not always because they're the most skilled player, but
mm,
they just have this knack of bringing everybody together, the
mm,
team spirit and so on. And then also, sports is really a good one. Professional sports is an interesting one for when you're talking about roles and which role your team needs of you, because especially with superstars who are in their prime of their physical fitness and so on,
mm,
have a certain role on a team. Basketball being my sport, it's really you really see it as then these superstars get older, aren't as quick and athletic, because professional sports is hard on your body.
mm.
They're talking about old athletes in their early 30s being old athletes, right?
Yeah.
He's already 32 years old. It's like, yeah. So there's just, you're paying at such a high level, and so your body can do more at 24 than it can at 32, and so what then happens is that person has played professionally all these years, so their level of experience is worth a ton,
Mm,
but their physical contribution may not be the same as what was before, and so their role within the team changes. And athletes who have trouble making that mental transition, they really struggle as they get on in their professional careers. And so
mm,
so really that one that's where roles are really strongly pronounced. Are you, in basketball we'll talk about, are you able to take a role off the bench, right?
mm,
To come, you're not one of the starting five anymore. Can you still come off the bench and contribute, or is it
mm.
going to affect you mentally, where it affects your ego, and no, I'm better than this. I should be, are you able to, or even if you think you're really good, and you're striving to work your way up into that starting five on a basketball team, but maybe the team needs different things from you. They don't need the
Mm.
things that you find the most fun, but you're skilled at other parts, and you can
Yeah.
adopt that to anything, in your workplace. And I wonder your role as a dad, right? I mean, it can be, the some fathers would be like, I'm the guy who lets them get away with things, or I'm the, I get to be the fun guy who does the games and stuff. But when it
Mm.
comes to doling out the discipline, I leave that to my partner, sort of thing. And so those are, it's also interesting to recognize what roles you like to play in all those different areas of your life.
Yeah. I mean, again, that relates to needs, but also to, I mean, to be honest, to energy level. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
do you have the energy to take on that responsibility right now, or is that something that you can push away? And yeah, that has to do with it as well.
Yeah, but especially in that role as a parent, it's
Mm,
recognizing that, well, there's the things that you want to contribute,
mm,
but there's also, a child has has needs for you to fulfill a certain role.
Yeah.
And the best parents know, how to do that. I speak from observation. I've never been a parent, so.
Yeah. No, but I mean, and again, this is off topic, but I mean, in these kind of discussions, you always come back to motivation, and that money is such a motivator for you. Uh, when you're a dad or a mom, you don't earn any money on that. You're not getting more a bonus for taking extra care of your child. It's all intrinsic, right? So
Absolutely.
you do it of love and will.
Absolutely, and we've talked about this on the motivational side. Why do people do these things that are voluntary, or that that they get so passionate about doing things that don't have any financial rewards? Parenting is more of a financial liability, right? But the people will make all these kind of contributions, but it's part of their road to mastery, right? They're learning a skill, or they're passing on knowledge, and that's helping them master something. So I think there's all kinds of reasons. I mean, why do I foster dogs? It's a lot of work. It can be stressful. You get these scared, skittish, but at the end of the day, it's also super rewarding for me, right? So, and I get to, there's a certain role I play in that animal's life, and it's not the long-term caregiver, but it's I'm helping them transition. I'm giving them some security, some safety, some leadership. And I'm sure that the things that I do there will help me in other areas, other roles that I play in life. So
yeah, for sure.
yeah.
Just one last thing, maybe. I see we've been talking for a while, but because you talked about sports, and I really like to, when I look at team development stuff, I love to look at bands, and in bands you take on a role that you can't leave. It's in sports, it's much more dynamic. In a band, you get a role, and it's very, very much in the eyes of the beholder. So the fans, they look at the band or this role, and you can't leave that, because if you leave that role, you're perceived as inauthentic or non-authentic or something. While for the fans, you're just showing one of your roles, right? And I'm amazed of these bands that can stick together for like 20, 30, 40 years and keep those roles. And probably they do a ton of stuff on the side, but when they get together, they get back into these roles where he's the front man and she's the bass player or whatever. And even in terms of behavior and how you interact with the fans, you have certain roles, and you just have to play them out and all the time. And I'm amazed of bands who are able to do that for such a long period of time. But we also see how extremely difficult it is. There are very, 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 very few bands who are able to do that, and they need a lot of support and management and help and etc. to do it. So it's something that I think a lot about. Yeah, I find it's really interesting.
Yeah, and having been a drummer in the past, I can relate to that. I played in some bands, and but I think the for any kind of entertainer, any time you're trying to please a larger audience, that's where it's really difficult to have authentic roles. And I've met people who've in the entertainment business who've been very successful, very famous, and some of them are just so authentic. And you can kind of tell that who they are on stage. It's maybe a more magnified version of a part of their personality, but at the end of the day, it's still them, right? And then you have other people who, they're playing a role like an actor, where this is what's expected of me, and I think that's where it breaks down. Where if you do this over time and you're playing a role that's not authentic to you, that doesn't feel right, I think that's why people walk away from fame, and it just does. It's not. It just doesn't fit with who they are, and sometimes it just takes time to realize that, right? And especially if you're in a role that doesn't feel like you, and you're trying really hard to play this role that other people expect of you, and then you you realize it's not you. It can cause a lot of emotional stress. So it's something to be aware of. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because especially in the entertainment business, I find that's fairly prevalent, but not exclusive to it.
No.
People play a role in their. You think about people who are in a partnership, raise a family, and then walk away from it. And it turns out that they were kind of living a lie, whether it was because of their sexual preference, their orientation. Maybe they didn't want to admit it to themselves, and they were playing a role. That's maybe an extreme case, but there are people who just realize, well, actually, I tried to fit this mold. I tried to, what society expected of me, what my family expected of me, and then they try to live this role that's not really them, and that's a really important thing to be aware of, right? Are you living an authentic role? And we talked at the beginning about how, there are roles that are just, a magnification or an extension of a skill set, or, still part of who you are. But then there are people who will try to play roles that are just unauthentic, and that has its toll over time. So, maybe that's a good place to wrap up. Hey?
Yeah. Well, there's so much to this topic. That's fun.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think I'd like to leave people remembering that, it's fine to play different roles, and it's necessary in a lot of cases. And the more awareness that you have around the roles that you play and what that means to you, what that means to other people, the more effectively you can execute that role, or you can live out that role and still be true to yourself and true to your values. And I think that level of awareness is really helpful.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I always say this: it's never finished. We're never done. We're a fruit continuing to get ripe, and we're gonna taste differently at different stages, perhaps. But
Yeah, like a good wine aging. Any one of those metaphors that you want to use. So, great, fantastic, really great conversation, and I learned some things from what you said, and. It really brought back a lot of, because it's been a while since I did my original coaching training, systemic coaching training. So it was good to talk about it again and refresh it. But so I hope the conversation was interesting for our listeners. If it was, and you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Please share with your friends if you're just listening to the audio. We want to really engage with and share knowledge with as many people as we can, and hopefully interact. So if you've enjoyed the content and you want to give us your feedback, leave some comments, have some questions, or give us a suggestion for a topic you'd like us to cover, then you can reach out to Tobi through his LinkedIn site, Tobias Demker, and then you can reach me at my website, peterteuscher.com. Really love to hear your feedback and your communication, and we will be sure to either get back to you or to respond through our podcast. So thanks again, everyone, for listening. Tobi, thanks for joining me again for another great conversation.
Thanks, Peter. See you in a few weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we'll talk to you all with a new topic in a couple of weeks, and until then, stay safe and be well.